Big Shaq walked into the airport, pulling his suitcase behind him. It had been a long trip, and he was ready to go home. His tour had been a success, and he was feeling good. He had met so many fans, performed in front of huge crowds, and even made some new friends along the way. Now, all he wanted was to get on his flight, relax, and enjoy the journey back. The airport was busy, with people rushing in different directions. Some were hurrying to their gates, others were waiting in long lines, and airport workers moved around, making sure everything was in order. Shaq adjusted his jacket and walked towards the immigration counter. He had done this process many times before, and it was usually quick and easy. He pulled out his passport and got in line, waiting for his turn. As he moved forward, he noticed a man at one of the counters. He was a tall officer with sharp eyes and a serious face. The man seemed to be speaking harshly to a traveler. Shaq could see the nervous look on the traveler's face. Something about the officer didn't feel right. He seemed to enjoy making people uncomfortable, but Shaq shook off the thought. He had nothing to worry about. His papers were in order, and this was just a routine check. Finally, it was his turn. He stepped forward, greeting the officer politely. "Good evening," Shaq said, handing over his passport. The officer, whose name tag read Bradley, barely acknowledged him. He took the passport and flipped through the pages, his eyes scanning every detail. "Where are you coming from?" Bradley asked in a flat tone. "From my tour. I've been performing in different cities," Shaq replied with a friendly smile. Bradley raised an eyebrow. "Tour? What kind of tour?" "I'm an entertainer," Shaq explained. "I do music and comedy. I travel a lot for shows." Bradley looked at him for a long moment, then at his passport again. His fingers tapped against the counter. The line behind Shaq was getting longer, but the officer didn't seem to care. "Wait here," Bradley said, stepping away with the passport. Shaq sighed, but he remained calm. This wasn't the first time he had been stopped for extra questions. He had nothing to hide. He waited patiently as Bradley spoke to another officer, glancing back at him a few times. A few minutes passed. Then Bradley returned, holding the passport in one hand. But something about his expression had changed. There was a smirk on his face, and his eyes held something unkind. "This passport," he said slowly, "doesn't seem right." Shaq frowned. "What do you mean?" "It's my passport. Everything is correct." Bradley tilted his head. "I don't think so." Before Shaq could say anything else, Bradley's fingers tightened around the passport. And then, to Shaq's shock, something unbelievable happened. Shaq watched in disbelief as Officer Bradley slowly lifted his passport, his fingers gripping it tightly. For a moment, Shaq thought the officer was just trying to scare him. Maybe this was some kind of strange joke. But then, right in front of his eyes, Bradley did the unthinkable. He tore the passport in half. The sound of ripping paper filled the air, and time seemed to slow down. Shaq's eyes widened. His heart skipped a beat. He couldn't believe what had just happened. His official passport, his proof of identity, his way home, was now in two pieces. The officer tossed the torn passport onto the counter, looking at Shaq with a smug expression. "There," Bradley said, crossing his arms. "Looks like you're not going anywhere." For a few seconds, Shaq just stood there, frozen. He had traveled to many countries, met all kinds of people, but never in his life had something like this happen to him. His passport was real. There was no mistake. And yet, this officer had destroyed it right in front of him, just like that, as if it meant nothing. Shaq took a deep breath, trying to control his emotions. He was angry, but he knew he had to stay calm. Losing his temper wouldn't help the situation. People in the line behind him gasped, whispering among themselves. Some took out their phones, recording what had just happened. "Why did you do that?" Shaq asked, his voice steady but firm. Bradley shrugged. "It looked fake to me. Can't take any risks." Shaq clenched his jaw. "That was a legal document. You had no right to do that." Bradley smirked. Well, too bad. No passport, no flight. You can step aside now. He pointed toward a small waiting area off to the side, as if Shaq was just supposed to accept what had happened and move on. Shaq could feel his hands tightening into fists, but he forced himself to stay in control. He wasn't going to let this man get to him. Instead, he turned to the other airport staff nearby. I need to speak to your supervisor, he said firmly. A few of the staff members hesitated. They had seen everything, and they knew this was wrong. But Bradley was their senior, and they didn't want to get involved. One of them, a young officer, looked nervous as he glanced at Bradley, then at Shaq. There's no need for that, Bradley interrupted. I make the decisions here. Now step aside. Shaq shook his head. No, I'm not stepping aside. You just destroyed my passport. I need to speak to someone in charge. More people were watching now. The whispering had grown louder. Some travelers were shaking their heads in disbelief. A few had already started recording, their phones pointed at Bradley. Then, from the corner of his eye, Shaq saw a man in uniform approaching. The way the other officers suddenly stood straighter made it clear this was someone important. And just like that, the situation was about to change. The moment the senior officer stepped forward, the entire atmosphere in the airport changed. The chatter among the passengers quieted down, and the airport staff immediately straightened up. Shaq turned to see a tall man in a crisp uniform, his face serious as he walked towards them with authority. His name tag read Captain Reynolds. Captain Reynolds stopped in front of Officer Bradley, his sharp eyes scanning the situation. He looked down at the torn passport on the counter, then at Shaq, and finally at Bradley. His expression remained unreadable, but there was something in his posture that showed he wasn't pleased. What's going on here? Captain Reynolds asked, his voice firm and commanding. Bradley shifted slightly but kept his smug expression. This man's passport looked suspicious, he said casually. I had to act. Captain Reynolds raised an eyebrow. Act? By destroying an official document. He picked up the torn passport and examined it closely. The tension in the air grew heavier. Shaq took a deep breath. Now that someone in charge was here, he had a chance to be heard. Sir, my passport was perfectly fine. I've traveled with it many times. He didn't ask for any verification, didn't check with any system. He just tore it in half and told me I couldn't leave. Captain Reynolds looked at Shaq, then at Bradley again. His face remained calm, but his eyes were filled with something else. Disapproval. He turned the passport over in his hands, running his fingers over the torn edges. Then, without a word, he walked over to a nearby computer. The entire room watched as he typed something into the system. The seconds felt like hours. Then, after a few moments, he looked back at Bradley. This passport was completely valid, he said in a cold, sharp tone. The passengers behind Shaq murmured louder. Some of them had been recording the whole event, and now it was clear that Officer Bradley had no real excuse for what he had done. The smirk on Bradley's face slowly started to fade. Sir, I was just being cautious, Bradley said quickly. You can never be too sure these days. Captain Reynolds slowly placed the torn passport back on the counter. Then he turned to another officer standing nearby. Get security in here, he ordered. Bradley's face paled. Wait, what? You destroyed an official document without any reason, Captain Reynolds said sternly. You overstepped your authority, and now you'll deal with the consequences. Shaq crossed his arms, watching as Bradley's confidence started to crack. He had been so sure of himself a few moments ago, treating Shaq unfairly with no fear of consequences. But now, the tables were turning. Two security officers arrived within seconds. One of them stepped forward, nodding at Captain Reynolds. Sir, escort Officer Bradley to the disciplinary office immediately, Captain Reynolds instructed. Bradley's mouth opened as if he wanted to argue, but no words came out. His eyes darted around the room, realizing that everyone was watching. Passengers had their phones out. filming every second of his downfall. Shaq exhaled slowly. Justice was being served faster than he had expected. The two security officers stepped forward, standing on either side of Officer Bradley. His face turned red, and for the first time, he looked uncertain. He had been so confident just moments ago, acting as if he was untouchable. But now, in front of everyone, his authority was slipping away. "Sir, this is unnecessary," Bradley said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I was just doing my job." Captain Reynolds didn't even flinch. "Your job does not include destroying valid documents and mistreating passengers," he said firmly. "You'll explain yourself to the disciplinary board." The security officers gestured for Bradley to step away from the counter. He hesitated, then threw a quick glare at Shaq. It was clear that he was still unwilling to admit he had done anything wrong. But now he had no choice. Under the watchful eyes of dozens of travelers and staff members, Bradley turned and walked away with the security officers. Shaq watched as Bradley disappeared down the hallway, his once proud posture now tense and stiff. The airport was silent for a moment. Then, slowly, the murmurs of the crowd returned. People shook their heads in disbelief. Some whispered about how shocking it was to see an officer act that way, while others praised Captain Reynolds for stepping in. Shaq, however, wasn't smiling yet. His passport was still torn. He was still standing in the middle of the immigration area with no way to board his flight. Captain Reynolds turned back to Shaq and picked up the torn passport from the counter. He let out a small sigh as he examined the damage. "I'm very sorry this happened," he said sincerely. "This should never have taken place." Shaq appreciated the apology, but an apology wouldn't get him on his flight. "I understand, sir, but what happens now?" "I can't travel without a passport." Captain Reynolds nodded. "Don't worry, we'll fix this," he assured him. He turned to one of the nearby officers, a young woman who had been watching everything closely. "Contact the passport office immediately. I want an emergency replacement issued for Mr. Shaq right away." The officer nodded and hurried off to make the call. Shaq felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. At least someone was taking this seriously. He had been worried that he would be stranded, forced to cancel his plans, or spend days dealing with the mess Officer Bradley had created. But now things were moving quickly in the right direction. Captain Reynolds gestured toward a waiting area. "Why don't you have a seat for a moment? We'll get this sorted out as soon as possible." Shaq nodded and moved toward the waiting area. As he sat down, he noticed that some passengers were still watching him, some even giving him nods of support. One traveler, a man with a camera hanging around his neck, walked up to Shaq and said, "I got the whole thing on video. If you ever need proof, just let me know." Shaq smiled. "Thanks, man. I appreciate it." Now, all he had to do was wait and hope his new passport arrived in time for his flight. Shaq settled into the waiting area, his mind racing. He couldn't help but replay the whole situation in his head, the way Officer Bradley had torn his passport without hesitation, without even a second thought. The more he thought about it, the angrier he felt. No one should have to go through something like that, especially not when they've done nothing wrong. He leaned back in his chair and glanced at the clock. Time seemed to stretch on as he waited. The airport was buzzing with activity around him. But Shaq felt like he was in a world of his own. Passengers hurried to and from their gates. Flight announcements echoed over the loudspeakers, and people were still whispering about the incident. It was clear that word had spread quickly. As he sat there, Shaq tried to focus on the positive. At least things were starting to get resolved. Captain Reynolds had already taken the right steps to fix the situation, and he was confident that the passport office would take care of everything. But there was still a small knot of worry in his stomach. What if the replacement passport didn't come in time? What if the flight was delayed and he missed it? He pushed those thoughts aside. There was nothing more he could do right now except wait. And while he waited, he couldn't help but think about the many times he had traveled in the past. Always without any issues, always able to pass through security with ease. His thoughts were interrupted when Captain Reynolds returned, holding a new passport in his hand. "Mr. Shaq, I've got your new passport," the captain said with a reassuring smile. Shaq stood up immediately, relief washing over him. "Thank you," he said gratefully, taking the document. The passport felt solid in his hand, a small symbol of the resolution to the chaos that had unfolded just hours earlier. Captain Reynolds nodded. "I hope this makes up for the inconvenience, and I'm sure the flight staff will give you priority boarding to make up for the lost time." Shaq's eyes lit up. "Really? That would be great, thanks." With a final nod, Captain Reynolds turned to walk away. "I'll leave you to it. Again, I'm sorry for the trouble. If you need anything else, don't hesitate to ask." Shaq watched as Captain Reynolds walked back toward his office, feeling a sense of gratitude. While it hadn't been the easiest experience, the way things had been handled now gave him some peace of mind. He glanced at his new passport, then at the gate information screen. His flight was still listed, but now he had the chance to make it. He quickly grabbed his things and headed toward security, still feeling the eyes of other passengers on him. Some smiled at him as he passed. Others gave him a thumbs up. When he reached the front of the line, the security officer recognized him immediately. "Mr. Shaq, I'm so sorry about everything that happened," the officer said sincerely. "No problem," Shaq replied, flashing a small smile. "It's all good now." With his new passport in hand, Shaq breezed through security, the process now smooth and effortless. The line was short, and he was soon heading to the gate. As he walked down the terminal, he could hear the flight attendants calling for final boarding. He quickened his pace, eager to finally get on that plane. Just as he reached the gate, the attendant waved him through, letting him board with a smile. Shaq felt a wave of relief wash over him. The drama was finally over. He found his seat in the first-class section and sat down, taking a deep breath. He looked out the window as the plane began to taxi down the runway. Soon, he would be in the air, on his way home, far away from the chaos he had just experienced. As the plane lifted off, Shaq closed his eyes for a moment, letting the quiet hum of the engines settle his thoughts. It had been a stressful day, but he was finally leaving it behind. The plane took off smoothly, climbing higher into the sky as Shaq settled back into his seat. He looked out the window, watching the city below grow smaller and smaller until it disappeared into the clouds. For the first time that day, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. The worst was behind him now. He was on his way home, and everything was going to be okay. As the plane soared above the clouds, Shaq leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. He let the rhythmic sound of the engines relax him, and his mind began to drift. The events of the day had been a whirlwind. 1 minute, he was minding his own business at the airport, and the next, his entire travel experience had been turned upside down by an officer's careless actions. He couldn't help but reflect on the way things had played out. Officer Bradley's actions had been completely uncalled for. Shaq had done nothing wrong, and yet he had been treated like a criminal. It made him wonder how many other people, especially those who weren't in the public eye, had faced similar treatment. It wasn't just about him. It was about the principle of fairness and respect for everyone, no matter who they were. As Shaq thought about it, he realized something important. His experience wasn't just about the destruction of his passport. It was a reflection of the bigger issues many people faced every day. He felt lucky that things had worked out in his favor, but not everyone had the same opportunity. He had a platform, a voice, and he could use it to help bring attention to the problems that so many others faced without the same resources. Just then, the flight attendants came by to serve drinks and snacks. Shaq accepted a cup of tea, which helped him relax even more. He thanked the attendant with a smile, and she wished him a pleasant flight before moving on to the next row. The small gestures of kindness felt even more comforting now that the tension of the day was behind him. Shaq took a sip of his tea, thinking about his fans and the support he had received throughout the ordeal. He had seen so many people posting online, sharing their thoughts, and standing by him. It made him feel good to know that there were people who cared, People who understood that what had happened to him wasn't just about one individual, it was about standing up for what was right. He pulled out his phone to check his social media, curious to see what people were saying. As he scrolled through the posts, he was amazed at the amount of support pouring in from all over the world. Fans, fellow celebrities, and even strangers had reached out to show their encouragement. One post caught his eye. It was from a fan who had witnessed the entire situation and had filmed the entire incident. The video had gone viral, and it had brought attention to what had happened at the airport. The post ended with a simple but powerful message. "We stand with you, Shaq. No one should be treated like that. Thank you for showing us how to handle injustice with dignity." Shaq smiled to himself, feeling a sense of pride. Despite everything that had happened, he had stayed calm, handled the situation with respect, and made sure to take the right steps toward resolution. And in doing so, he had gained something much more important than a new passport. He had earned the respect of people all over the world. The rest of the flight passed by peacefully. Shaq watched a movie, enjoyed a meal, and relaxed as the miles slipped away. Soon, the pilot made an announcement that they would be landing shortly. Shaq looked out the window one last time, a sense of anticipation building as he thought about getting back home. He had learned something valuable today. No matter how difficult or unfair a situation might seem, there was always a way to get through it. And in the end, he knew he would always be able to use his voice to stand up for what was right. As the plane descended, Shaq could feel the excitement building inside him. He had been away for so long, and while the journey had been filled with challenges, he was finally heading home. Home to the familiar comforts of his city, to his friends, his family, and the life he had worked so hard to build. The landing gear touched down with a soft thud, and the plane slowed to a stop as it taxied toward the gate. Shaq felt a wave of relief wash over him. He was back on solid ground. It had been a long day, but he had made it through. As the seatbelt sign turned off, the passengers began to gather their things, preparing to exit the plane. Shaq stood up, stretched his legs, and walked down the aisle. His mind still replayed the events at the airport, but now it felt like they belonged to another world, another version of his day. The past was behind him, and the future was waiting. He made his way through the airport, following the signs toward baggage claim. The familiar sounds of an airport, footsteps, announcements, the quiet hum of the crowd, felt comforting. It was a busy place, but it felt peaceful compared to the chaos he had faced earlier. As he reached the baggage claim area, he spotted a few fans standing nearby. They recognized him immediately and waved. Some of them had big smiles on their faces, while others looked a bit shy, unsure of how to approach him. Shaq smiled and waved back, always happy to connect with the people who supported him. "Shaq, you're a legend, man," one fan called out. "I saw what happened at the airport. That was messed up. Glad to see you made it through okay." Shaq nodded, grateful for the support. "Thanks, bro. It wasn't easy, but we made it through." As he waited for his bag, he couldn't help but think about how lucky he was. He had fans who genuinely cared, and people who stood by him when things went wrong. The world wasn't always fair, but moments like this reminded him that kindness and support could make a huge difference. His bag finally appeared on the carousel, and he grabbed it, feeling a sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just about the suitcase. It was about the journey, the lessons learned, and the people he had met along the way. Shaq walked out of the baggage claim area and into the main terminal. The airport was quieter now, with fewer travelers rushing around. He spotted a few more fans who smiled and waved as he passed by, and he waved back, feeling the warmth of their positive energy. He made his way to the exit, where a car was waiting for him. As he got into the back seat, he took a moment to reflect. He had been through a lot today, more than he had expected, but in the end, everything had worked out. The car started moving, and Shaq looked out the window, watching the city skyline slowly come into view. It was a beautiful sight. The lights of the city sparkled in the distance, and he felt a sense of belonging. He was home. As the car drove through the streets, Shaq couldn't help but feel a deep sense of gratitude. He was lucky to have made it through the day, and he knew that no matter what challenges life threw his way in the future, he would face them with the same strength and resilience he had shown today. Home was more than just a place. It was the people, the experiences, and the sense of peace that came with it. And today, he had learned that no matter what happened, he could always count on the people who stood by him and the strength he found within himself. As the car pulled into Shaq's driveway, he couldn't help but smile. The familiar sight of his home brought a sense of peace he hadn't realized he'd been craving. The house was quiet, surrounded by trees and the gentle hum of the city beyond. He stepped out of the car and into the cool evening air, breathing in deeply. After everything that had happened today, the simple act of being home felt like a breath of fresh air. He grabbed his bag and walked up to the front door, feeling the weight of the day slowly lift off his shoulders. There had been so much chaos, unfair treatment, stress, and uncertainty, but now it was over. He was where he needed to be. Shaq unlocked the door and stepped inside, the warmth of the house greeting him immediately. His footsteps echoed in the hallway as he made his way to the living room. He was eager to just relax and reflect on everything that had unfolded. But as he walked further into the house, he was greeted by a familiar voice. Shaq. It was his younger brother, Jamal, who had been waiting for him. Man, you made it. How was the flight? Shaq smiled and threw his bag on the couch. It was good. Long, but I'm glad it's over. Some stuff happened at the airport, but I'm all right now. Jamal raised an eyebrow. What happened at the airport? Shaq sat down on the couch, stretching his legs out in front of him. It's a long story, but basically I got caught up with an officer who decided to tear up my passport for no reason. There was a lot of confusion, but it all worked out in the end. I'm just happy to be home. Jamal's eyes widened. What? That sounds insane. But I'm glad you're okay. Man, you always seem to handle crazy situations so calmly. I don't know how you do it. Shaq chuckled and leaned back. I don't know either, but sometimes you just have to take a step back, breathe, and keep your cool. Getting upset wouldn't have helped. I just focused on getting things fixed. Jamal nodded, clearly impressed. I see what you mean. I guess it's easy to get caught up in the moment, but it sounds like you did the right thing. You've got some serious patience, bro. Shaq smiled again. It's not about patience. It's about understanding that things don't always go the way we expect. And when they don't, we have to make the best of it. The conversation shifted to lighter topics as Jamal started telling Shaq about his own day. They laughed and joked, the tension of the day finally starting to ease. Shaq appreciated these quiet moments, away from the spotlight, just spending time with family. As the evening went on, Shaq thought about the bigger picture. Today hadn't just been a reminder of the struggles he faced. It had also shown him the power of staying true to himself. It was easy to feel lost or discouraged when things went wrong, but keeping his head high and handling things with dignity had made all the difference. His phone buzzed on the table, and Shaq picked it up. It was a message from one of his fans. The message read, "You handled everything like a pro today. You're an inspiration. Thanks for showing us how to stay calm and stand up for what's right." Shaq read the message and felt a sense of pride. The support from his fans, and even strangers, had been overwhelming. It wasn't just about what had happened at the airport. It was about the message it sent. Standing up for yourself and others, no matter how tough the situation, was always worth it. As he sat there with Jamal, feeling the warmth of home and the love of his family, Shaq knew that the journey wasn't over. There would always be challenges ahead, but he was ready for them. With the support of those around him and the lessons he had learned along the way, he knew he could face whatever came next.